Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
The millionaire took his lover home after his wife's funeral and was shocked to see. The Fernandez mansion was enveloped in a gloomy atmosphere after Teresa's funeral. The dignified and elegant woman had been by Anthony's side for nearly 3 decades, becoming an irreplaceable part of his life and career. Guests came to pay their respects, each moved as they remembered Teresa, who always appeared with a gentle smile and a compassionate heart, constantly helping those around her. But right after the funeral ended, Anthony left everyone stunned. He showed up with a young woman on his arm, who held him with an arrogant air, her eyes betraying an unmistakable haughtiness. The woman was Sandra, a rising model in the entertainment world, and from the moment she walked in, she captured everyone's attention. But what filled people with disgust was how Anthony laughed and chatted, disregarding the sorrow of his late wife's passing to indulge in a showy display with his young lover. "Anthony, really, don't you feel ashamed?" Carmen, Teresa's closest friend, could no longer hold back. Her eyes were sharp, mirroring the anger bubbling within her. Anthony merely gave a faint smile, his expression cold and defiant. "Teresa and I had a happy life together, and now she's at peace. Don't I deserve to find happiness, too?" His casual and heartless words cast a shadow over the room, prompting many to shake their heads and whisper among themselves. Yet Anthony appeared indifferent to the judging gazes around him, focused only on Sandra, who looked at him with satisfaction. In a corner of the room, Richard, Anthony's loyal assistant, watched silently. He had been with Anthony and Teresa for many years, witnessing Teresa's quiet sacrifices for her husband's career. Richard felt a deep pain seeing Anthony's heartlessness so soon after the passing of his devoted wife. "How could he do such a thing?" whispered Maria, a servant in the mansion, to Richard. "Mrs. Teresa was such a kind woman. No one deserves to be treated like this." Richard shook his head, lost in thought. "I can't understand it either. Teresa gave up so much for him, and this is what she receives in return." Just then, Sandra flashed a taunting smile at those whispering about her. "It seems like people aren't used to change, are they?" she said, squeezing Anthony's arm tighter. "But we'll get used to it soon enough." Sandra's smug words felt like salt in the still fresh wounds of those grieving Teresa. Unable to hold back any longer, Carmen stepped up to Anthony and spoke bluntly. If Teresa were still alive, how would she feel seeing this scene? Anthony responded with a cold gaze. "So what if she were still alive?" "Teresa is gone, Carmen. Life goes on, and I don't intend to keep mourning forever." That response felt like a slap to the faces of everyone who had once admired Teresa. Anthony's coldness and insensitivity left many feeling outraged. Richard turned away, unwilling to witness the disgraceful scene any longer, but knowing he had no right to speak out. Sandra, seizing the moment, smiled gently at Anthony, as if everything belonged to her, and no one had the right to object. "We should leave, Anthony. This place is suffocating with all their judgment." Anthony nodded, fully absorbed in Sandra's words. He didn't look back at the crowd, not showing the slightest bit of sentiment for the people who had shared so many memories with him and Teresa. As they walked away, Carmen let out a heavy sigh, her gaze somber as she watched her late friend's husband vanish with his new companion. Richard clenched his fists, his heart weighed down. The image of Anthony's revered wife lingered deeply in his mind, and the way he treated her after her passing was simply unforgivable. Anthony's final words echoed in the minds of everyone, marking the end of all the respect and admiration they once had for him. The mansion suddenly felt cold and empty after Anthony and Sandra left. The remaining guests quietly departed, carrying with them disappointment and anger. The image of the Anthony they once knew faded away, leaving only a haunting memory of a man who, driven by greed and insensitivity, trampled over cherished memories to pursue fleeting pleasures. The next day, news of Sandra's appearance at Teresa's funeral quickly spread among the elite. It was a scandalous story, accompanied by countless whispers and contemptuous glances aimed at Anthony. Those who had once admired him for his talent and success now only saw the shamelessness and heartlessness of a man blinded by desire, incapable of appreciating what he had. Yet, Anthony seemed unaffected by the gossip. On the contrary, he embraced it, as if it were nothing but meaningless words. Just a few days after Teresa's funeral, Anthony decided to throw a party at the mansion. He invited his close friends, well-known figures in the business world, and, of course, Sandra was the star of the night. That evening, the mansion gleamed, starkly contrasting with the gloomy atmosphere it held after Teresa's death. Joyful music played in the living room, expensive wine glasses clinked together, and laughter echoed throughout. Sandra, dressed in a striking red gown, drew all eyes toward her. She seemed friendly, smiling and chatting with each guest, but her eyes held a proud, arrogant gleam, as if she stood above everyone else. "I think Mr. Anthony truly knows how to enjoy life," Michael, a longtime business partner of Anthony, remarked with a hint of approval as he sipped his wine. However, those around him couldn't help but feel uneasy about the comment. Carmen, Teresa's closest friend, attended the party with the hope of speaking directly to Anthony and reminding him of everything Teresa had sacrificed for him. She couldn't accept this spectacle. Anthony, the husband Teresa had once cherished, now seemed like a complete stranger. She approached Anthony without hesitation, looking him straight in the eyes. "Anthony," she began, her tone serious. "Do you honestly think Teresa would be pleased to see this? A lively party when she's only just been laid to rest?" Anthony laughed, not bothering to hide the contempt in his gaze. "Carmen, Teresa is gone. Whether I throw a party or not doesn't matter anymore. She's not here to care. But at the very least, you could respect her memory." Carmen replied angrily. "Teresa devoted her life to helping you build your career. And how do you repay her? By betraying her right after she's gone." Anthony shrugged, his tone calm, almost indifferent. "Teresa chose her path. She willingly gave up her career to be with me. That was her decision, not mine." His words cut Carmen and everyone who had once respected Teresa like a knife. Anthony's heartlessness had reached a level none of them could have imagined. Richard, the longtime assistant, could no longer bear it. He stepped forward, gently pulling Carmen away, fearing her anger might turn into an uncontrollable confrontation. Meanwhile, Sandra, observing from a distance, couldn't hide her satisfied smile. She moved closer to Anthony, placing her hand on his shoulder and whispering, "You don't need to worry about them. They're just jealous of our happiness." Anthony nodded, indifferent to the judgmental looks surrounding them. He focused solely on Sandra, completely captivated by her charms, ignoring everything that had once been an important part of his life. A moment later, Carmen decided to leave the party. Before leaving, she looked back at Anthony one last time, her eyes filled with disgust and disappointment. "You will pay for everything you've done to Teresa," she muttered, not knowing if Anthony heard her. To her, Anthony was no longer the respectable man she once knew, but rather a selfish and callous individual. After Carmen left, the party continued with joy, as though Teresa's presence had never existed. Laughter echoed, wine glasses were raised, and Anthony's gaze was fixed solely on Sandra. Richard stood silently in a corner, witnessing it all with a bitter heart. He couldn't understand how Anthony had become this kind of man. To Richard, Teresa was not only his employer's wife but a remarkable woman who had always been kind to him and everyone who worked in the house. Now, he felt only disgust toward Anthony, who had so ruthlessly betrayed Teresa. When the party ended, Anthony and Sandra were laughing and chatting, oblivious to the simmering resentment in the hearts of those who had once loved and respected Teresa. The Fernandez mansion was now a place full of superficiality, where values and loyalty no longer had any place. Anthony was lost in his own world, unaware that he had lost everything of true value. The next morning, Anthony arrived at the lawyer's office with a smug expression, entirely unfazed by the rumors circulating among the upper class after last night's ostentatious party. He sat down in the reception area, his gaze arrogant as he looked around, especially at Michael, a longtime associate of Teresa's and the lawyer entrusted with reading her will. Michael adjusted his glasses, his tone both serious and cold. "Sorry to keep everyone waiting. Today, we'll be reading the will of Mrs. Teresa Fernandez. Present are family members and a few of her important associates." Anthony smirked, his gaze undisguisedly disdainful as he looked at Teresa's family members. He was certain he would receive the bulk of the inheritance since Teresa had no children or other heirs. The atmosphere grew tense as Michael began to open the document. In the room were some of Teresa's relatives and close friends, including Carmen and her cousin James. All watched Anthony in silence, their eyes filled with contempt, while he sat with his legs crossed, his expression smug. "Before reading the will, I would like to say a few words," Michael spoke, his sharp eyes directed at Anthony. "Mrs. Teresa dedicated her life to this family and to Mr. Anthony's career. I hope that anyone who inherits this estate will honor and remember all that she has done for us." Anthony scoffed, uninterested in Michael's words. He was simply eager to hear the specifics of his inheritance. Michael began to read. According to the will of Mrs. Teresa Fernandez, her entire estate, including her shares in the company and personal assets, will be transferred to the Teresa Fernandez Foundation to support abandoned women. The room fell silent. Anthony's face shifted from smug confidence to shock, then to panic. "What?" he growled, unable to believe what he was hearing. "How can that be? All of her assets should be mine." Michael remained unfazed by Anthony's outburst. He calmly continued reading, seemingly unbothered by the man's rage across from him. "Mrs. Teresa created this foundation to support abandoned, elderly women who have endured suffering and loneliness, much like she did." Carmen, Teresa's closest friend, couldn't hold back a satisfied smile, her lips curling slightly as she whispered to James. "Teresa finally did what she always wanted. This is a fitting end for a traitor like Anthony." Anthony abruptly stood up, slamming his hand on the table. "This is an insult. She can't do this to me. I am her husband, the one who built everything she had." Michael shook his head, his tone steady but cold. "Please control yourself, Anthony. This is a legal and binding will. Mrs. Teresa decided to dedicate her entire fortune to a higher cause, rather than leave it to you." James couldn't hold back his laughter, his eyes full of disdain. "It seems you're not the center of the universe as you thought, Anthony. Teresa had her plans in place for a long time." Anthony looked around, seeking sympathy from those around him, but all he found was silence. No one had any intention of supporting him. In that moment, he realized he had truly lost everything. Michael's voice continued to ring out. "In addition to leaving her entire estate to the foundation, Mrs. Teresa has provided documents exposing illicit activities Mr. Anthony has conducted during the process of building his hotel empire. These documents will be forwarded to the authorities." Shock and panic were etched on Anthony's face as he stammered, unable to form words. "No, no, she can't do this to me." Michael responded calmly, his gaze piercing into Anthony. "I believe she can, and in fact, she already has. Your shady dealings, corruption, and dark transactions will no longer be hidden. Teresa prepared everything to protect the weak and vulnerable people she deeply respected." In the corner, Carmen clapped slowly and sarcastically, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she watched Anthony struggle. "Anthony, you can't escape the truth forever. This is the price you pay for everything you did to Teresa." Anthony glared at Carmen with hatred, but he was at a loss for words. He was utterly silenced by the anger of everyone around him. Those who once respected and admired him now looked upon him with nothing but contempt and satisfaction at witnessing his downfall. Anthony slumped back into his chair, his face pale, his gaze filled with helplessness. Everything he had considered his assets, hard work, even his career, had vanished with a simple nod from lawyer Michael. As Anthony tried to process what was happening, Michael continued. This is still not all, Mr. Anthony. Mrs. Teresa included further provisions in her will that I need to read. Anthony swallowed hard, struggling to regain his composure, though his trembling hands betrayed him. What else? He asked through gritted teeth, barely concealing his anger. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze resolute. Mrs. Teresa designated a successor for the CEO position of the hotel company she and you built, in case you failed to meet the ethical and legal standards required by the company. Anthony couldn't believe what he was hearing. He shot up, his voice hoarse with anger. A successor? What do you mean? That company is mine. No one has the right to decide except me. Michael replied coldly. I'm sorry, but Mrs. Teresa held a significant share in the company, enough to make executive decisions if needed. And she has chosen the appropriate person to replace you. Anthony stared at Michael in disbelief, hoping to find some trace of empathy from the lawyer, but all he saw was indifference. At that moment, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, with sharp features and piercing eyes. This man was David, Anthony's secret son. Hello, father, David said, his voice calm yet commanding, his gaze icy as he looked at Anthony. It seems it's time we officially met. David's unexpected appearance left Anthony reeling. He stared at the young man, feeling as if he were confronting a version of himself from years past. But what struck him was the absence of any emotion in David's eyes for the father he had never met. David, why are you here? Anthony stammered, his face filled with confusion and panic. David shrugged, replying in a calm voice. My mother endured a lot because of you, and Teresa was the one who helped us get through those hardships. She wanted me to take over the company and preserve her legacy, rather than watch you destroy it all for your greed. Anthony stood frozen, unsure of what to do. All his plans, every calculation, had been shattered by Teresa's actions. He growled, trying to regain authority over David. Who do you think you are to replace me? This is my company, and you're nothing but a stranger. David let out a faint, dismissive laugh, unfazed by Anthony's words. This company used to be yours, but not anymore. Teresa set everything up for me to take over and run it. She didn't want you to destroy everything she built just to satisfy your own selfishness. In the corner of the room, Carmen watched with deep satisfaction. She held James's hand and whispered. Teresa planned everything perfectly. Anthony deserves every bit of this for what he's done. James nodded in agreement, his gaze filled with contentment. This is the end he deserves. Justice is finally being served. Michael continued reading the rest of the will. Alongside the shares and control of the company left to David, Mrs. Teresa also requested that all future profits from the company be directed into the Teresa Fernandez Foundation to support women facing hardship. Anthony was nearly losing his mind, yelling. No. This is unacceptable. The company and assets are mine, and no one has the right to interfere. David looked at Anthony, his gaze cold but resolute. Father, this isn't about who owns the company, it's about using what we have to help others. This is for Teresa, and you will have to accept it, whether you like it or not. Anthony was speechless, unable to counter him. He realized that everything had slipped beyond his control, that Teresa had meticulously prepared to protect her legacy from his greed. Carmen stood up, looking at Anthony one last time, her eyes filled with contempt and satisfaction. Anthony, you will live in failure and shame. Teresa knew exactly who you were, and she set everything in place to prevent you from destroying her life and the lives of others. Anthony could only stand still, his eyes red with anger, but there was nothing he could do. Everyone who had once been a part of his life, from Teresa to David and even Teresa's closest friends, had now turned their backs on him. This was the price he had to pay for his betrayal and indifference. Anthony sat motionless, the silence thick around him as he stared at David, the son he had never acknowledged. Before him, everything he had once held in his hands was slipping away, piece by piece, as if Teresa herself were delivering him an unforgettable lesson from beyond. He clenched his jaw, his hands tightening as he tried to hide the fury boiling inside. David's gaze was unrelenting. He turned to Michael and said, "Uncle Michael, can we finalize the paperwork to secure my inheritance and the CEO position?" Michael nodded. "Of course, David." Mrs. Teresa ensured every legal detail was in place. "The company is now in your hands, as per her wishes." Carmen, standing in a corner, watched silently with a look of fulfillment. She couldn't conceal her satisfaction as she saw Anthony lose all the power and assets he once believed were untouchable. She walked over to him with a mocking smile. "Did you really think you could live your life without anyone holding you accountable? Teresa was never as easily defeated as you imagined." Anthony scowled, his eyes full of hatred. "Carmen, are you siding with these traitors? Do you have any idea how many years I put into building this empire? Neither you nor Teresa could ever understand the effort I invested." Carmen scoffed, her tone laced with disdain. "Anthony, you never understood Teresa. She sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay her. Don't think your greed will bring you happiness. Life is ready to punish you." David stood quietly, watching the tense exchange between Anthony and Carmen. He spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "Father, perhaps the best thing you can do now is accept the truth and step down with dignity. This company is no longer yours." Anthony laughed bitterly, full of defiance. "You think you can take over the company and run it better than me? You're just a kid who knows nothing about this industry." David replied calmly. "Maybe I don't have as much experience as you, but I'll run the company according to the values Teresa held dear, no more greed or selfishness." Everyone in the room turned to Anthony, their gazes filled with both contempt and disappointment. He felt as if he were being surrounded, with no way out. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a man entered, Carlos, one of Anthony's longtime business partners from the early days of his company. Carlos looked around, his gaze stopping on Anthony with a look of disapproval. "Anthony, I've heard the rumors about what's been happening. Did you really cast aside Teresa's memory right after she passed?" Anthony suppressed his anger, attempting to appear composed under Carlos's questioning. "That's none of your business, Carlos. I have the right to live my life after Teresa's gone." Carlos shook his head, his voice filled with contempt. "You're not just living your life, you're betraying Teresa's memory, the woman who helped you build everything you have today. What you've done is something no one could ever forgive." Michael stood up, restoring the solemn atmosphere of the will reading. "We still have one final clause in Mrs. Teresa's will." He cast a cold glance at Anthony before reading aloud. "In the event that Mr. Anthony resists or takes any action to hinder the transfer of the company to its rightful heir, all associated assets will be frozen and transferred directly to charity." Anthony stood up abruptly, his eyes red with anger. "I won't let this happen. This is my property, the work of my entire life." David stepped closer to Anthony, his voice steady and unwavering. "You had the chance to live a life of happiness and gratitude. But now that you've lost everything, maybe it's time you learn to respect someone else's legacy instead of living in arrogance and indifference." Carmen and James, standing next to Carlos, nodded in agreement. James said with satisfaction, "Anthony, it's time you paid the price for everything you did to Teresa and those who cared for her." Carlos added, "Your business partners won't stand by you if you continue this behavior. We're ready to support David because he deserves this position far more than you do." Anthony looked around, his eyes filled with rage and disappointment. He realized he had completely lost the support of everyone. The career he had built from the ground up was slipping from his grasp, irretrievably. Anthony remained frozen in the center of the room, his eyes dark, devoid of the arrogance and pride he once held. Everything he once controlled, from his power to people's trust, was slipping away. In the heavy silence, Michael quietly gathered the documents, concluding the reading of the will. Everyone began to stand, preparing to leave, but not without casting one last look of contempt at Anthony. David stepped closer, his gaze firm yet sympathetic. "Father, it's time you took a good look at yourself. Teresa was not just a wife or a business partner. She was a woman who sacrificed everything for you, and in the end, you repaid her sacrifices with betrayal. Now, you must pay the price." Anthony fought to suppress the anger boiling within him, but each word from David cut deeply into his pride. "You have no right to lecture me. You don't understand the struggle I endured to get here." David shook his head, his voice calm. "I don't need to understand because nothing justifies your indifference and selfishness." Carlos, Anthony's longtime partner, approached and placed a hand on David's shoulder, his voice steady. "David, if you need any help taking over the company, just let me know. I've seen enough of Anthony." Anthony looked at Carlos, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Carlos, we've worked together for years. Are you really going to turn your back on me?" Carlos raised his eyebrows, replying without hesitation. "I don't turn my back on friends, but for someone who betrays the very person who helped them build everything, I have no reason to stay. Teresa deserves more respect than this." Michael nodded in agreement, casting a steely look at Anthony. "Just as Teresa anticipated, you would never change. But now, Anthony, you must face the consequences of your actions." Anthony could only stand there silently, watching each person leave the room, their gazes filled with contempt and disappointment. When the last door closed, the room felt empty, as cold and lifeless as his existence now seemed. A week after Teresa's will was made public, Anthony's life had fallen into despair. His wealth, power, and the trust of those around him were gone in an instant. But perhaps what he hadn't anticipated was Sandra's reaction, the young lover who had clung to his arm at Teresa's funeral, seemingly unaffected by the whispers around them. At first, Sandra acted normal, but day by day, as she realized Anthony no longer had the power or money to support her lavish lifestyle, her attitude began to shift. Her cold demeanor became more apparent, her sweet words turned into irritation, and their outings became rare. One afternoon, as Anthony sat in the living room, reflecting on everything that had happened, Sandra entered, her stance arrogant but showing signs of impatience. She glanced around the mansion, once filled with luxury but now barren, stripped of valuable items Anthony had sold to retain some assets. She sneered as she sat across from him, unhesitatingly addressing him. "Anthony, how exactly do you think we're supposed to live like this?" Sandra asked coldly, her eyes devoid of any affection. Anthony looked at her, struggling to keep his voice calm. "Sandra, this is only a rough patch. I'll find a way to get everything back." Sandra laughed derisively, not bothering to hide her disdain. "A rough patch? Anthony, you've lost everything. The company, the money, the reputation, it's all gone with Teresa. What do you have left?" Anthony tried to keep his composure, but the weight of his loss left him tense. "I spent my entire life building everything. I'll find a way to regain control. You should believe in me." Sandra let out a laugh, the sound echoing coldly through the room. "Believe in you? Do you think I came to you out of faith?" She leaned in closer, looking at Anthony as if he were a defeated man. "I was with you because you were a millionaire, Anthony. Because you had everything a woman could dream of. But now, all you have left is failure and a ruined reputation. Did you really think I would stay out of love?" Anthony was left speechless. Sandra's words felt like knives cutting deep into his pride. She stood up, her voice icy and sharp. "Ever since I heard about Teresa's will, I knew this was where it would end. You're just a failure, Anthony. You couldn't keep anything, not even the respect of those who once trusted you. Even your late wife ensured you wouldn't get a single cent." She sneered, her eyes gleaming with contempt. "You're pathetic." Anthony looked at Sandra, struggling to suppress his anger. "Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? I gave you everything, fame, a luxurious life. Without me, you'd be nothing but an ordinary model. Sandra crossed her arms, her face filled with defiance. Yes, but that was when you were Anthony the millionaire. Now, you're just an old man past his prime, and I have no intention of wasting my youth on a failure. The atmosphere grew heavy, and Anthony felt as though everything within him was unraveling. He had not only lost his wealth and power, but now the young lover he had once flaunted was abandoning him as well. Sandra checked her watch, then stood up and said firmly, "I'm leaving now. There's nothing left here to keep me. I've found somewhere else, a place that matches my ambitions better." Desperately, Anthony tried to grab Sandra's hand, clinging to whatever remained. "Sandra, stay. I'll get everything back, I promise." Sandra pulled her hand free, looking at him with pure disdain. "You promise?" "It's too late, Anthony. I don't have the time to wait for you to reclaim what you've already lost." She turned her back on him, leaving Anthony alone in the now empty and cold mansion. The door closed behind Sandra, and he realized that everything he had once deemed important was now gone. He had lost his wife, lost his company, and now even his lover had left him. The room felt barren, leaving Anthony alone with his bitterness. He sat down, his vacant stare fixed on the empty space before him. For a brief moment, he remembered the old days with Teresa, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him without asking for anything in return. And now, all he had left was emptiness. Sandra's departure symbolized more than just the loss of a lover, it marked the collapse of a life built on selfishness and indifference. Anthony felt the stark reality that he was left with absolutely nothing. Everything he once saw as symbols of power and pride was now reduced to fragments of a past that could never be reclaimed. Anthony sat quietly in the mansion, now more desolate and cold than ever. Everything he had once cherished was now lost. He hadn't just lost his wealth and career, but his pride and the trust of those closest to him. The feeling of loneliness overwhelmed him, and in that moment, he realized he had lost everything that truly mattered. He rose and walked to Teresa's room, where she had kept every photo, every memento of their years together. The familiar scent of Teresa lingered, reminding him of the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He stared at her photograph, her gentle eyes seeming to reproach him in silence. Anthony felt a pang in his chest, a surge of sorrow and regret filling his heart. "Teresa," he murmured, his trembling hand reaching out to touch the photo. "I really was wrong, wasn't I?" His voice was weak, a far cry from the arrogant, self-assured man he once was. Just then, the family's longtime housekeeper, Elena, entered the room. She had worked for the family for over 20 years and had been the person Teresa trusted most. Seeing Anthony standing silently in front of his wife's photo, she couldn't help but sigh. "Sir," Elena began, her voice gentle but tinged with reproach. "Mrs. Teresa dedicated her entire life to you, building everything you have. And how did you repay her?" Anthony stayed silent, unable to look Elena in the eye. He knew she was right, and his heart was heavy with remorse. "Elena. I was wrong. I hurt her, I betrayed everything she ever did for me. And now, all I have left is this emptiness." Elena looked at him, her eyes filled with disappointment but also a hint of compassion. "Your mistakes can't be easily erased, Anthony. What you did not only destroyed Mrs. Teresa's life but hurt everyone who once loved and respected you. But perhaps, it's not too late for you to make amends." Anthony looked up, his eyes full of despair. "But how, Elena? I've lost everything. My whole life was built around power and money. I don't know how to make things right." Elena nodded softly, then took Anthony's hand and led him out of the room, where she regularly prepared donations for the Teresa Foundation, a charity Teresa had established. The room was filled with crates of relief supplies, clothes, medicine, and thank-you cards from women Teresa had helped. Mrs. Teresa didn't create this foundation for fame but to help vulnerable women who, like her, endured pain and hardship, Elena said. This is her true legacy, Anthony. Anthony looked around the room, the thank you cards filled with grateful words from strangers stirring up a sense of guilt within him. He hadn't realized that Teresa had done all this quietly, never asking for his acknowledgement. He picked up one of the cards, reading each word, and felt his heart tighten. Elena, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve her love or everything she did for me. Elena sighed, then looked at him with a steady gaze. You're right. You didn't deserve it. But now, you have a chance to change. Teresa left you a legacy not of money or power, but of compassion and kindness. If you truly want to make amends, start here. Anthony sat down, his hands trembling as he set the card back down. A feeling of regret and remorse overwhelmed him, leaving him at a loss for words. Elena. I've been so selfish. I betrayed everything Teresa stood for. I lived only for myself and forgot everyone else. Elena nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder, a comfort he felt unworthy of receiving. It's never too late to change, Anthony. But what matters is whether you truly want to change. Anthony raised his head, his eyes filled with anguish and regret. He knew Elena's words were true. Teresa had left him only one path for redemption, and he couldn't continue living in the past. I want to change, Elena, he said, his voice shaking. I'll do anything to make up for my mistakes, to be worthy of her love and trust. Elena looked at him with encouragement, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. If you truly mean that, start with the little things. Teresa helped so many people, not for money, but because she understood their pain. You can do that, beginning with this foundation. Anthony nodded, his heart filled with repentance. This was his last chance to make amends, to do something worthy of Teresa's love. He knew that without this effort, he would never find peace. In the days that followed, Anthony began volunteering at Teresa's foundation. His arrival was met with skeptical glances from the staff and the women who sought help there. None of them could forget his reputation, a wealthy man who had once been callous and selfish, even betraying the wife who had sacrificed her life for him. Anthony entered the center, his expression one of shame and unease. Elena, who now managed the center and had stood by Teresa from the beginning, observed him silently. She approached, looking at Anthony with a stern gaze. Sir, if you're here to help, leave your title behind, Elena said, her tone firm but sincere. Here, we don't need a wealthy boss. We need someone who truly understands pain and knows how to share. Anthony nodded, feeling the weight in his heart. Elena, I understand. I'm not here for recognition or praise. I'm here because I want to do something to make amends, even if it'll never be enough to make up for what I did to Teresa. Elena nodded quietly, her eyes softening. Then you can start by meeting and listening to the women who come here. They're people who went through the same pain Teresa understood. If you can truly listen and share in their stories, maybe you'll understand the meaning of what Teresa did. Following Elena's suggestion, Anthony sat at a small table near the reception area, where women seeking support came in for help. His first day was a difficult test as he listened to the stories of women who had been abandoned, abused, or were struggling to survive. Each story felt like a cut to his soul, reminding him of all the mistakes he had made. A woman named Rosa approached his table, her eyes swollen from crying. My husband left me and our 2 young children without a word. I have no job, no income. I don't know what to do anymore, she said, her voice trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. Anthony looked at Rosa, guilt filling his heart. In the past, he had heard of such situations but had never cared. Now, facing it directly, he could finally understand the cruelty of his indifference. Rosa, I'm very sorry for what you've been through. We'll do everything we can to help you and your children through this difficult time. Rosa looked at him with surprise, as if she couldn't believe his sincerity. But Anthony's gaze, for the first time, was no longer that of a powerful man, but of someone trying to atone. She nodded slightly, managing a weak smile. Thank you. I never thought someone like you would truly care about people like us. When Rosa left, Anthony sat back, feeling a wave of bitterness. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of everything he had ignored. In all his years chasing power and wealth, he had lost sight of the true value of humanity, empathy, and compassion. In the afternoon, Anthony continued to meet other women, each carrying their own painful story. One woman, Lucia, abandoned by her husband and living on the foundation's support, shared that she had never encountered someone of high status who genuinely cared about her situation. Mr. Anthony, Lucia said, her voice choked with emotion. I used to think that wealthy people only cared about their own lives, never thinking about us, the ones at the bottom. But today, as you sit here and listen to us, I feel a bit of hope. Anthony felt his eyes well up with tears. Lucia's words pierced his pride, making him realize that his remorse was not only a duty to Teresa but also regret for having turned his back on people he had once considered invisible. Elena stepped forward and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Sir, these are the people Mrs. Teresa always wanted to help. They are the reason she founded this foundation. She understood their pain because she, too, faced loss and hurt. Anthony nodded, his eyes red. Elena, I understand now. Teresa spent her life doing this, helping those who needed protection and love. I was so blind, so heartless. Elena looked at him, her gaze both gentle and stern. If you truly want to make amends, let your actions speak for your remorse. Do it for Teresa, and do it for yourself, so that you might finally find peace. Anthony sat quietly, and for the first time, he felt a slight sense of relief. He realized that atonement required more than words, it demanded genuine action. And here was the place he could start. In the following weeks, Anthony spent more and more time at the center. No longer the wealthy, arrogant man, he became a listener, someone who understood the pain of women who had been abandoned and hurt. Each day, Anthony faced real stories from people seeking help. Those stories made him feel even more regretful and sorrowful. One morning, Anthony was tasked with leading a group discussion at the center. The women gathered around him, each bearing their own struggles. Among them was Sophia, a single mother struggling to raise 2 young children after her husband left her. Sophia spoke with a bitter tone. I thought I'd never be able to stand again after the betrayal. But because of this center, I found hope. Without Teresa, I don't know where I'd be. She was the one who made me believe I deserved a better life. Anthony listened to Sophia's words in silence, guilt swelling within him. He recalled everything Teresa had done for others, actions she never mentioned to him. A kind-hearted woman had stood by him for almost 3 decades, yet he had been so unthinking and cruel. He lowered his head, his voice breaking. Teresa, she did all of this, and I never realized it. I lived in a selfish and blind world, never noticing what she truly cared about. Sophia looked at Anthony, recognizing the pain and remorse in his eyes. Mr. Anthony, none of us know much about you. But if you're here because of Teresa, maybe she saw something in you. She never gave up on anyone and always believed people could change. Anthony offered a bittersweet smile. Thank you, Sophia. Yes, I lost her, and now all I have left is regret. But I hope that by helping you, I can make up for some of my mistakes. Throughout the discussion, Anthony listened to each woman's story, every tear and shared hardship. Together, they found a sense of solace in each other's strength and determination. In each woman, Anthony saw a reflection of Teresa, a resilient spirit determined to overcome hardships, just as she had been. Elena, the center's manager, watched Anthony's transformation with understanding. After the discussion, she approached him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Anthony, Teresa would be proud of what you're doing. You've changed so much since the first day you came here. This is what she always hoped for you. Anthony looked at Elena, his eyes brimming with tears. Elena, I lost a remarkable woman. Now, all I have are memories and regret. I don't know if anything I do will ever be enough to make up for it. Elena shook her head, smiling gently. Atonement isn't about achieving a specific result. It's a journey you embark on, living by the values Teresa left behind. As long as you continue, that's the most sincere apology you can offer her. Anthony sat quietly, absorbing Elena's words. He realized that atonement wasn't a destination, it was a commitment to daily actions and effort. Months later, Anthony became an indispensable part of the center. No longer a temporary volunteer, he was genuinely devoted to helping others. The women who came to the center began to see him as a friend, a listener, and someone who understood. One afternoon, while organizing supplies, Elena approached him with a photograph of Teresa, a picture taken during the early days of the foundation. In it, Teresa was smiling softly, her eyes filled with pride and happiness as she saw the women she had helped. Holding the photo, Anthony felt a surge of emotion. Teresa, she truly lived a meaningful life. I couldn't see that when she was alive, and now all I have is this memory. Elena placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice gentle. What matters is that you've come to realize it. She will surely forgive you. What you're doing today is a testament to your love for her, even if it's come late. Anthony nodded slowly, feeling a profound sense of relief. He knew that, while he could never completely undo the past, by living according to Teresa's values, he had finally found peace within himself. In this way, Teresa's legacy would continue to live on through acts of kindness, the lives touched by the center, and through his own journey of redemption. The story of Anthony and Teresa reminds us of the importance of compassion, love, and respect in our relationships. Teresa symbolizes quiet sacrifice and kindness, always helping others without seeking recognition. In contrast, Anthony lived for power and selfish pursuits, realizing his mistakes and the meaning of love only after losing everything. Anthony's redemption shows us that, even if it's late, people can change and find peace through sincere actions. Don't wait for loss to appreciate the good around you, for love and gratitude are life's most precious assets.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.